Let's get started. Thank you all so much for joining us today and spending a few minutes with us. My name is Bill Worrell, and I'm a director at First Service Residential. And welcome to our Ask the Experts virtual event. Today, we're level setting and focusing on 2020, the recap of 2020, that is, and what we're anticipating and looking forward to and working on in 2021. So thank you all so much. Eleanor, Janice are behind the scenes. Thank you both for administering the technology. I'm going to jinx us just a bit. We've never once had an issue on one of these sessions. So the track record is successful and 100%, and we appreciate your hard work for that. But for our attendees and for the audience, just a programming note, if we do run into a glitch due to bandwidth and the stress we're putting on all the systems these days, rest assured we'll get this back up and connected. So please be patient if that does happen in an unlikely event. And so now to our esteemed panelists. I'm going to start off introducing our team today. First with Babette Bennett Marshall. Good morning, Babette. Babette is our Senior Vice President of Financial Services at First Service Residential. So a lot of wood to chop this year, right, Babette? Thank you so much for joining us. We then have Steve Harshman, Vice President in Southwest Florida, Condo and HOA Division. Thank you, Steve, so much for joining us today and taking the time. And then finally, Kim Panios. Kim is another Vice President with First Service Residential, supporting our high-rise division. So I think we've got everything covered today, right? We've got finance, we've got the high-rise and the HOA communities, and thank you all so much for your time. So there's no denying, certainly, that COVID-19 pandemic altered life as we know it in all of our communities, literally changed the way we do business, daily operations in a lot of communities. And within days, we were all asked to adjust and change those operations. And so what we decided to do at the very end of 2020 was send out a survey, which so many folks received and responded to, and we appreciate that. And really reflect on 2020, what were our challenges, and receive that feedback. In addition to that, we decided to set up this session today, which is looking forward to 2021. So really want to just close the loop here. We want to learn from 2020. As was quoted recently at New Year's Eve, and when we celebrated the New Year of 2021, nobody flipped a switch and changed everything back to normal. Right. So what did we learn from 2020, and how are we going to carry that forward into 2021 as a management team and working with board members? And so all the data that we received is really the main topic of conversation today. You'll notice at the bottom of your screen the Q&A tab as well as the chat tab. So we will be adding the survey results from the end of 2020 into that chat. You'll be able to view that as we walk through today's Q&A session, Ask the Expert session. And then, of course, if you have questions that pop up during the discussion, feel free to please add those in the Q&A session as we go through. We'll get to as many as possible. We've also had a lot of questions submitted upon registration. We will respect everyone's time today. So rest assured that anything that we can't touch upon or something that perhaps might be very specific to a given property, one of our team members, one of our subject matter experts will reach out to you directly. We want to make sure that everybody gets all the information that they need. And then finally, this session is being recorded, and so you will receive a follow-up link after today's session with a recording. For those who perhaps weren't able to make it, feel free to share the recording. And for those of you that may want to refer back to the information in the future, you can save that recording and refer back to that. So thank you so much. So Eleanor, let's start off with our first poll here for the audience to take. And so the question is, how would you rate your association's overall performance in 2020? And the host, I and our panelists are not allowed to vote. So this is strictly for attendees. So please take a moment and select your best answer for your community. Okay. Looks good. Looks good. So look at that. We're very, very close to how the survey results came back. The trend is absolutely there. We pride ourselves in testing ourselves, and this test worked. So the trend is absolutely there. This leads us perfectly into our first conversation. The vast majority of boards in 2020, according to the survey, rated their performance as excellent or good. And the number one reason for being excellent or good was their ability to successfully manage their budgets. So we're going to start off with Babette. The first question, Babette, is what key things really did communities do to manage their financials among the pandemic and all the changes that we were faced with?
Thanks for that question, Bill. First of all, good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here and to share. One of the things that, as we all know, the pandemic came out of nowhere, right? And what we found with a lot of our boards that drove success was looking in detail at their budget and determining, do they have enough funds to keep the lights on and cut the grass? Just, and it was, a good rule of thumb was they would want to consider having at least 2 months of operating fund in order to keep the association afloat. For those associations that didn't, the important thing was what are their options? Their options were, where would they get additional funding? Because they're looking at, some reduced revenues. A lot of those revenues, such as the lifestyle revenues, those came to a standstill. And as well as the increased expenses around PPE, increased cleaning, just to name a few. The boards who did very well and fared were the ones who took a hard look at every single line item. And, everything from, what are those discretionary spending? Holiday parties, the flowers, whether those are the seasonal planners, those things are more from a need, a want more so than a need, right? The beautification. They looked at those and pulled those back and went through every single line item and did a reforecast. It was also important for them for the associations to be proactive in managing this, because that way they can know whether, okay, are we looking for some short-term funding like a line of credit? Or in some cases, some may have considered special assessment, which we'll get into later on in the conversation, because that may not have been the best decision around special assessment. So I'll defer to the rest of the SDN panel.
Thank you, Babette. I think some of the things that, as you said, we were very successful with was engaging with the boards and going through the budgets. And some of the things that we found very successful was adjusting and repurposing your staffing. For example, if you had pool or beach attendants, those associates were repurposed to help with the enhanced cleaning and sanitization, and also some of the contactless services that we were providing to the residents and continue to provide throughout the pandemic. So those also help to really serve to manage their expenses.
Yeah, I agree. So, and Kim, that's important. We were smartly reallocating the resources. Mm-hmm. It was important for all residents to feel comfortable. And I think for Babette as well, for the board to feel comfortable, looking at the budgets, looking at the financials, but also taking that back to the balance sheet, right? And just giving them peace of mind. If they had the cash, the recommendation is usually about 3 months operating. If you had the cash, we're going to manage this and get through it on a month-by-month basis.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm. Great. Excellent. So the next section is the boards that rated themselves fair or poor. And I'll dig deeper here. Kudos to the brave board members that did rate themselves as poor. So that was 8%, 19% total fair or poor. They cited the confusing and conflicting state, local, municipal regulations. And this really was everything from the World Health Organization to the CDC. Then we got down to the state, and then we got down to the county, and then we got down to the local or municipal regulations. And it seemed like all this information was coming from different places. And how were we going to comply? What were we going to do? What was the right path of action? So the question is, how did your communities ensure that critical information was communicated effectively? Kim, if you could kick us off from that
Yeah,
perspective.
Bill, that's a great question because you're absolutely right. In the beginning of this pandemic, we did have conflicting information from counties, cities, et cetera. So we have, as you know, the COVID task force and also a disaster team that many of us on this panel are actively participate in. And one of the things that we created was the COVID Resource Center within Connect, so that all of that information went to the COVID Resource Center and could be communicated to the CAMs, and then communicated to the various communities and the members within the community. But we absolutely have a lot of resources to do that in terms of communication to our residents. And Steve, maybe you could share a little bit of what you did in terms of how you communicated with the residents in the HOA division.
Yeah. Good morning, everybody. Yeah, like Kim mentioned, the COVID task force really helped streamline the information that was going out to our residents from the top down. Because even the news channels, depending on which news channel you watch, you got conflicting information. So we really wanted to send the same message to all of our residents, and it changed on a daily, changed daily. So through the COVID toolkit, we were able to communicate on a daily basis with our teams, and now also provide samples of posting of notices and procedures when we're having to shut down certain amenities, and best practices as far as what we should be doing. So we communicated this down to our teams, and then they're sending the same information to their residents and to their board members, and with recommendations to check with their attorneys and so forth. So yeah, that's how we tried to streamline that information.
Yeah, really a big help for the board members and for our management teams locally to be able to sift through the information and not get bogged down with a plethora of information. I'll note also for our audience today that we mentioned this COVID Resource Center. For those, of course, that are not clients of First Service Residential, you can find all this information as well on our website with documentation and webinars as well. And really, I think there's a best practice to be carried from 2020 right into 2021, and that is being prepared for different emergencies as they move forward. The alignment in hurricane season and communication, right, Steve, as you mentioned, it was very easy to repurpose your communication plans for the pandemic. And now as we move into vaccination phase, right, and all the different information that we're receiving there, and that information is changing as well. So I think the underlying purpose here is really set that best practice and then share that information with the world. So good stuff. Question number 3. So increased cost of sanitation. Kim, you touched on this, and this was a big, Bobette touched on this as well. This was a big challenge for us in 2020. So the question is, what did communities do to offset those expenses at the start of the pandemic? And how did they plan for them going into 2021, right? So there was kind of a readjustment in the budgets and the financials. So Kim, if you'd like to build on that reallocation and start us off with that answer.
Absolutely, Bill. One of the things that we did in conjunction with Bobette and her team early on was to create a specific GL code within our financials where all of those COVID related expenses went to. So it was very easy for us to track what the association was spending for COVID, separate and apart from their normal janitorial and or PPE expenses. So that was one of the things that we did. We also at First Service opened a procurement center, because in the beginning of the pandemic, I know a lot of people will remember trying to get a mask, trying to get disinfectant, any sanitizing supplies was very difficult. So we did open the procurement center where our CAMs were able to order things online and pick them up or have their regional director deliver them to them. So, and many times that was at a significant cost savings to the association, as well as Bobette touched on earlier, reprioritizing their line items within their specific budgets. And I know Babette may want to talk a little bit more about capital planning and how that changed throughout the year.
Thank you, Kim. Yeah, all great points. And I did want to touch on something that Steve mentioned earlier. It was around the attorney fees, right? Well, those were unplanned expenses. So when you think about that, a well-managed association should be looking, doing some future planning, right? What we did immediately, as Kim mentioned, is we created that special code. Additionally, we rolled out a financial risk mitigation guide. Because let's face it, the finances piece, not everyone are accountants, right? So what we did was we rolled out a very user-friendly spreadsheet that essentially put all your line items in and gave everyone an opportunity to do a monthly reforecast of those expenses that were either going up or decreasing. And so with that, we called it a forecast tool. Worked in collaboration with our operational partners to just demystify that piece of it, right? Focused on the income statement, but also at the same time looking at the balance sheet and looking at those things that we needed to make sure we're focused on. Because one thing that we didn't want to lose sight of is that we still needed to make sure that those critical expenses, such as taking care of the boilers and that will protect the investment for the future, that won't result later on in another unplanned expense. We also, because of the timing, we accelerated our 2021 budget process because we had the muscle memory. And so it was a good time for us as we were going through the forecasting to plan accordingly to see what 2021 may look like. Looking at those things that may have been non-recurring, like purchasing tons of dispensers and all the PPEs, and at the same time looking at the expenses that we will need to continue to monitor and to make sure that our residents are safe, because we do know that we do have these stringent requirements to keep our guests, our residents safe.
Right, and I'll just note here, as we dig a little bit deeper into the data, the number I have here is 85%, a vast majority, 85% of board members adjusted budgets and policies to align with social distancing and stay-at-home orders. So I like that idea of being able to segregate expenses that were one-time expenses for equipment and sanitizing stations and those types of things, and then to use that data to adjust your forecast for the following year. And where do we need to translate? And I'll also note, as we anticipate more folks working from home, we did see kind of upward pressure on some of the utilities and trash pickup and those things that happen when folks are home all day. So some adjustments there in the budgeting. And I think some good takeaways for folks to take a look at. Steve, we're going to start off with you on the next question here. And the number is 54% of board members surveyed said that they changed their 2020 plans as a result of COVID-19. Certainly, with the most significant change being adjusting policies to align with that social distancing that we mentioned. So give us some insight, Steve, as to how your communities adjusted existing policies to comply with pandemic-related restrictions. And as we move forward, perhaps you can note a couple that are going to stick around. Some of these changes, right, might not change, at least not in the foreseeable future, if you could.
Yeah, absolutely. So our larger properties, lifestyle properties, were drastically affected. They have a full-time lifestyle director, and they had to really pivot when it came to their activities for their membership. It was a very devastating event that happened, and we're still having to deal with, right? And so we know a lot more about the virus now, thank God. But in the beginning, everything pretty much had to come to a halt. So I had properties that had a lot of events and activities going on for the membership because it was the peak of the season, and we had to cancel all of those. And so a lot of them eventually went virtual, but in the beginning it was just a full halt. And so it was again, that messaging, getting alignment in the messaging, make sure we're getting it down to our teams. But we also looked at our projects that we were planning on doing over the summer. Going back to some of the things that Bobette mentioned, we looked at our projects to help offset some of those expenses. So projects were put off to 2021. I'm seeing a big spike in projects for 2021 because everybody's ready to go. But we saw a lot of our communities really have to change how they're doing their social events. I think our lifestyle directors did a fantastic job at taking advantage of things like this, going virtual. And so very interesting.
Absolutely. Kim, anything to add there?
Yeah, I think some of the things that we saw across the board, such as using the virtual platform for board meetings and annual meetings, has also, had a positive effect on many of the associations, because we had enhanced participation from residents who may not be full-time residents within the community. So that was one of the positives that came out of some of these changes, was the ability for unit owners that don't reside at the properties to participate. And I think a lot of my communities are going to continue with that platform going forward, because it's been very effective. A lot of the communities have also switched to online voting. Some had started already, some that were kind of on the fence about it, now have switched to online voting. And then we've done some other pretty creative things. We've done set up virtual office hours for the office during the parts of the pandemic where we really had offices closed, but we set up virtual office appointments so that residents could meet with the staff virtually. And then contactless package delivery, contactless trash services for those people that might not be leaving their units, in order to safeguard them and the rest of the community. We also coordinated contactless dog walking. So you think about all the things that you would normally have to do in your home that you go outside for, and all of a sudden you can't. Mm-hmm. Contactless grocery delivery, right? We did it all. So those are some of the ways that the board's really adjusted and worked with us to adjust to really for the betterment of the community overall.
Yeah, and I think that leads us perfectly into the next question. But I think also to add some context to this piece about adjusting existing policies to comply with pandemic-related restrictions. So I checked, just confirmed the 2020 U.S. Census data, and there are just over 331 million folks living in the United States today. And we also hear the plans coming out of the White House, now the federal government, 100 million people vaccinated in the first 100 days, and we're looking at 1 million people a day on average, and certainly the ambition is to push that up. So if you think of it, it's also my understanding that the vaccine is going to last roughly a year. So if you think about 331 million people and 365 days in a year and 1 million people a day, you're looking at perhaps 12 months to get everyone vaccinated. Oh, and by the way, at the end of the 12 months, if the vaccine is a year-long vaccine, we're just going to start right over again, right? So I think that it's something to think about, something to consider. And as associations are looking for this, we're all excited to come out of the other end of the pandemic, but we may have to take a deep breath and think about those numbers and the data and how are those policies going to be impacted into the foreseeable future. So with all of that being said, the number here is 80% of boards reported, as you all just mentioned, 80% reported that community events were either changed or canceled as a result of the pandemic. Steve, I know you have a lot of communities with F&B, food and beverage operations. So the question is, and we're going to start with you here, how have your associations approached community events, these events and F&B operations specifically in the era of COVID-19?
Yeah, so the food and beverage department was actually affected drastically. Just recently, I had to close down a food and beverage operation at one of my largest properties because COVID employees started having COVID. And then out of safety, as soon as we had one, we ended up closing the restaurant. And then it turns out there was several other staff that was also infected with COVID. So Food and beverage is drastically affected by this. And what we've done is, we've used as much as the PPE as possible. We've also taken advantage of some of the cleaning companies, the sterilizing companies, to come in and sterilize the dining rooms and so forth. We've also made it where it's outside dining only in our food and beverage department too. So our inside dining currently is not available. And as far as the lifestyle goes, I mentioned it before. They pivoted quickly to going virtual, and they're starting to, they become experts at Zoom. We've all had to figure that one out. But now we're starting to see a little bit more activity, not necessarily on the property, but the lifestyle directors are taking advantage of the local municipality events that are going on there, and trying to get participation at those events. Lifestyle has definitely been affected, but I think we've done a pretty good job at navigating the situation.
Right, do whatever we can, right? That's such a great amenity for a community. Do whatever we can, but we want to continue to operate safely. And
yeah, a lot of our residents move into the communities because of the social aspect, right? And then you lose that, it impacts the residents.
Right,
Absolutely.
being sensitive to that, absolutely. And Kim, some lifestyle programming. I think we even took yoga online, right? And
we did. That was pretty amazing. We launched a lifestyle and health and wellness program in 2020, which was very well received by our residents, especially in high rise. If you think about living in a high rise versus an HOA, if you're in an HOA, you might be able to walk out your back patio and be in the backyard in fresh air and be able to do some things. When you're in a high rise, you're out on your balcony and that's it, or in the hallway. So we took advantage of the lifestyle program, and they did launch yoga and some other fitness things, as well as some online classes, cooking classes, and there was a lot of really fun activities for our unit owners and our residents, and they really enjoyed it. And I think that was one of the things that was also very helpful in keeping people engaged and keeping a little bit of the frustration level down for those people that and may still be in their homes and not able to go out. And it was very well received.
Yeah.
right.
In some of my HOAs, one of the greatest things that I saw was, my golf cart parades. Those were really neat to see for Halloween. That they would, or even Christmas, they dressed it up in the theme of the holiday, and I saw a lot of those going on in some of my larger HOAs.
Golf cart parades, I love
Yes.
that.
Yeah.
That's fun.
In some ways, it really brought the community together, because
Sure.
usually they would be somewhere else in a different community or something. So it was nice to see that.
Great, Steve, thank you so much. So 14%, this was interesting to me. I thought the number would be a little bit higher, but 14% of board members responded that they would be prioritizing emergency and crisis planning in 2021. So this is on some board members' minds. Have you seen, Kim, we'll start off with you here. Have you seen a similar trend in your communities with your board members? And, what are your thoughts around that?
I think actually a lot of our boards were very responsive and very reactive in 2020 in terms of crisis planning and managing that. I think that has carried over in most of our communities to 2021. I think that everybody realizes that the pandemic is not gone. And I know that in terms of, that also involves financial planning, which I know Babette has some thoughts on that she'd like to share with us.
Sure, please do.
Yeah, thank you, Kim. Let's face it, COVID fatigue has set in. I was very surprised by the 14%, right? Because in our mind, that, as you said, Kim, the pandemic is still very much here. So it is problematic if long-term planning and emergency planning is not a priority, because it's important to, if you're, some of the things that we mentioned, those expenses, we need to gauge what that looks like for us today and in the future. So what taking into that emergency planning, it helps us to figure out, will we need some level of financing to get us through the next year or two? At least, so we're at least more proactive than reactive, because you said, like you said, Kim, there were boards who reacted right away, and that was the right thing to do. But part of what we're encouraging is that for us to be more proactive, to avoid, that all of us wish we won't have to ever live through another pandemic, and I hope so, hope not. But in terms of just everything from just the hurricane, right? Hurricane, that's something that us here in Florida, and not all of you are Floridians, but you may be from Tennessee or Georgia, there is some level of emergency that will occur. And so it's important to plan, whether that's emergency funding, if you're setting fund aside for those emergency funds. There were some associations that we saw who actually ended up with a surplus this year. And there were debates between some of those board members as to what to do with that surplus. Mm-hmm. One good rule of thumb, to not give it back. Those were healthy debates among the board members. The most prudent decision is to actually use that for your long-term planning.
Right. I think a lot of this is peace of mind, right? The goal is to absolutely hit that budget. And if you can achieve a surplus, it's just gonna help us all to feel a little bit more comfortable. And then I think also there's a propensity, as we think about disaster preparedness and moving into the future and how all of this relates, there's also that risk mitigation piece and that liability piece that really hasn't been resolved, and we want to just be conservative, right, with that. So all residents and their communities want to feel safe, and their guests. So for sure, across the board. So then you move into 95%. The 95% of board members, the flip side of this, said that they were considering changes or adjustments to policies and plans in 2021. So Kim, how are your communities actually adjusting the policies to align with this? I even hate to use the term new normal, as the new way of living moving forward. How are your communities, what are you seeing out there, and how are they adjusting into 2021?
Well, so Bill, as most communities with amenities and lifestyle programming are aware, we've had to adjust capacity, for example, in our gyms and amenity areas. And most of our associations where we have saunas and things like that, they still remain closed, but we've had social distancing at pools and gyms and other amenity areas. We've had, as I said earlier, some contactless services that we've provided to residents. And we've also looked very early on in the pandemic, a lot of the associations worked with their attorney to adjust rules and set policies in terms of guests, visitors, again, specific criteria around their amenities. So we saw quite a bit of that early on, and I think a lot of that has continued, and I think most of the communities have worked with the phased rollout throughout the pandemic. We did see some that were a little more conservative because they felt that they couldn't quite manage it as well as they would like to. So they were a little more conservative and held back until they felt like that they had a better grasp on it. But I think overall, the boards did a really good job of partnering with us and working together with the community to really get this process in place, and their attorneys as well.
Right. And digging a little bit deeper there into the data, I think that communication has been key, really focusing on communication so that we're able to discuss and adopt policies. But then more importantly, perhaps, is to communicate those policies and adjustments to the membership and the why, what's behind this, what's the thought process. So communication and policies was 10% of focus. And then I think you can think about strategic planning, which was another 14%, because those daily operations and those policy changes do roll back into our business plans for the community, right? And what is the strategic planning? What are those changes that are going to happen over the next 12 months to our business plan? And that's why that plan is there, to go back and be able to adjust that and keep everyone on the same page. So let's jump into our second poll for our attendees today. What is the most important area you will focus on in 2021? I'm looking forward to these results. Okay, we'll give it a couple more seconds here. Okay, Eleanor, let's see what we have. There you go. So the test, ladies and gentlemen, the test worked again. Maintenance and capital improvements, and I'm just aligning all the data from the survey as well, and aligning that with today's session. Yeah, 49% exactly there. 49% identified maintenance and capital improvements. So as we, perspective around this, strategic planning, business plans, maintenance and capital improvements are a large part of those plans. And this is what the focus is on 2021. So the question bears, what trends are you seeing going into 2021 as they relate to capital improvement projects? So Kim, walk us through that. 49%, so half of the boards are looking at that. And if you include strategic planning, you're at 64%. And, if you look at those together, so talk to us about those plans and what you're seeing boards doing to adjust and what you think you're going to implement in 2021 in capital improvements.
Yeah, Bill, thank you. As we know, a lot of associations deferred capital improvements in 2020. So in 2021, the race is on, right? So working with the boards and the community to create a long-term plan and a strategic plan to address the needs of the community, working with your reserve analyst, regardless of whether you have reserves or not. Like we have some communities that don't have reserves. They've elected not to, but they still rely on a reserve study as a gauge for where they may need to be in terms of long-term expenses. But I think putting together that critical plan for their capital improvement projects. The other piece of that obviously is financing. Where's the money coming from? Is it coming from your reserves? Is it coming from a special assessment? And really looking in 2021 and beyond as to what, if it's not reserves, what your community can bear, right? So we're seeing a lot of talk around that. Again, specific to financials, we saw insurance premiums rise significantly this year. So that's also affected their long-term plans, capital and otherwise. So those are really some of the things that we've seen. And I know that many of our communities have been very fortunate to work with First Service Financial to develop plans for financing their capital improvements and or emergency lines of credit as we move through these.
Yeah, I think you're right. So that deferred maintenance that we mentioned earlier, rolling into capital improvement plans, that's where that's going to happen.
Yeah.
So Babette, talk to us about what you're seeing in the financial side of things, the financial statements you're reviewing and your team is producing. What are those implications and options that you're seeing boards take advantage of?
Yeah, definitely. That's another great point, and it was great to see that everyone is aligned around that, right? Strategic planning and capital planning. The trend we're seeing is because of the lower interest rates, that more and more associations are taking advantage of long range and taking advantage of whether that's short term or long term loans, because of the historically low rates, which helps to spread the burden over a number of years, versus a one-time special assessment, which can be detrimental in a time of economic downturn. And while we haven't, so another thing that we have been working on is looking at trends. We've been closely monitoring our AR trends and seeing where, we're seeing a decline in collection. Because that will have an impact on the association. The concern is around special assessment during these times is if you already have your residents, your owners who are economically strapped and unable to pay their regular assessments, assessing an additional special assessment could further, drive that person into additional financial constraints. And so it's what the funding, low interest rates does is that working in conjunction with our First Service Financial Group, our associations were able to take advantage of those low interest rate and just spread that burden over a number of years. I know Steve had some thoughts around that as well.
Steve, yeah.
Yeah, like you said, Bobette, I'm seeing a lot of associations take advantage of those low interest rates right now. So, our strategic plan for 2020 went out the window. So we adjusted it accordingly. But for 2021, I'm seeing a lot of boards take advantage of the situation. So they're looking at their reserve study, like Kim mentioned, and they're doing their pool renovations maybe a year earlier to take advantage of this time when there's not as many people here, as also and to take advantage of the fact that social distancing and so forth is affecting the enjoyment of the pool area in the facility. So I'm seeing a lot of capital projects that way, taking advantage of what we're currently going through.
Well, I think that there's a lot said there. I think that there's a silver lining with interest rates, right, to all of this. Historically, in my lifetime, I've never seen interest rates anywhere near here, and they're not projected to go up anytime soon. So that's something to think about. And it's also interesting to give a number. 5 billion, I think, is the number in loans that were achieved last year in 2020 as boards started to integrate these plans, whether they had reserves or not, into their maintenance and capital improvement programs. And I think the last thing I'd like to note there, Bobette, you mentioned, just to dig into that maybe a little bit more, we have had the eviction moratorium pushed back now to the end of the first quarter. I know this is a community specific issue. Perhaps it might affect communities that theoretically have more renters in them than communities that don't. Are you seeing any movement there yet with collections, or is it too early? We're just kind of trying to keep an eye on that right now, right?
Yeah, so as you said, Bill, it's another great question. It depends on the community. We've seen some communities are starting to see the softening in the collection, and others they're fine. But it's important for us to stay vigilant and pay close attention to that.
Right. So again, community specific, it might be a good idea to forecast that and look at that. Just a simple look at your roster, how many are principal residents, second and third homes, and then of course investment homes, and how that might be impacted. Might be a good tip to keep an eye on that.
Yeah, Bill, there was a point here around, and I always use the attorney plug here because you really want to stay in contact with your attorney as you're navigating through this, because some of the trends that we've seen in terms of questions that have come up is, how do you treat one owner who can pay versus, another owner who may be able to pay, but is sitting there saying, but, I'm not going to pay. I want to hold on to my cash. And so the, attorneys that have been on panels such as this have given advice around, you have to treat every single owner the same way. So even though the moratorium is there to protect the renters, the reality is the mortgage still needs to get paid for some of our owners, and they still need to pay their maintenance fees. So it's important to be aligned with your attorneys to make sure you're getting great advice.
Yeah, and there's some perspective here too. I think, so much of this we have seen before, just in different iterations. So for example, during the financial crisis, we saw a massive spike in collections, of course. So we've been there. And we've had those conversations and those best practices around what do you do in that type of an environment. So we want to anticipate, take those learnings from 2006, 2007, and apply them now to this specific component. There is one difference, and that is property values. And what was interesting back then is that we saw property values declining, and owners and investors alike found themselves upside down. What they said was upside down in their units. The values now had declined below what they owed on the unit, if they owed anything. And they said, it's just not worth it. I'm not going to pay the maintenance fees. I'll collect the rent as long as I can get away from it, get away with it, and I'll walk away. That's a key difference, I think, to recognize in this cycle. Perhaps collections, and we're looking at all of this, but property values, particularly here in Florida and a few other places in the southern US, have maintained or escalated in a lot of communities. So there's still an investment value there. So I think that there's a little bit of an advantage, if you will, for management and for boards to, as you said, Bobette, perhaps treat everyone the same, maintain those collection policies, be vigilant, follow through with them. So just some perspectives around what we've learned in the past and then what we're anticipating hopefully doesn't happen. But I think it's prudent for us to at least think about it and be ready for that type of scenario, right?
Yeah, absolutely, Bill. No, those were the conversations we were having with our board members in March and April as COVID became more and more serious and the shutdowns began. We worked together with Bob Bett, creating those forecasts to try to see what type of delinquencies we were going to expect. And fortunately, most of the properties are faring very well, and we're not seeing an increase in delinquencies. So, good point.
Yeah, I just wanted to spend a few more minutes on this, on the budget and the collections, because I will say that in our business, it's a big mistake to go to any community and treat them the same as the next community next door and to do the same thing. We all know that every community is different in lifestyle, in personality, in objectives and goals. And so everything needs to be crafted on a community by community basis, ultimately. But I think that it's important to just look at that financials and budget and collection of regular maintenance fees. That might be one area that is absolutely consistent, top of mind, and important across every community. So I think that's one thing we can all feel safe talking about and focusing on is, are we with the budget? Are we going to be able to collect the maintenance fees? What does that look like for our community? And just spend some extra time on that today. So thank you all for that. Our next question is with regard to virtual business. So 89% of boards, again, the vast majority, no surprise here, plan to continue conducting association business virtually in 2021. I think this is here. I think this is not going to go away for the most part. And this is, of course, due to safety concerns, but also we've seen increased participation. And let's be honest, a little bit more convenience, especially with board members who are unable to travel to be at the board meetings in person, right? So Steve, kick off with you here. The question is, how have your communities seen an increase in participation now that a lot of association business is being done virtually? Are you seeing that as well in your communities, an increase in participation from the membership? And then Kim, I'd like to jump in with you after that to talk about the e-voting process. Steve, go ahead and kick us off there.
Yeah, in the very beginning, everybody went virtual, and it was kind of learned by fire hose, if you will. A lot of mistakes along the way, but once our board members got used to the idea of the virtual setting, and we all learned how to use Zoom and the other platforms to the best of their ability, it became very efficient. And so we have a lot of residents that do live up north during the summer that are unable to participate in board meetings. And so I saw drastic increases in the participation in these meetings. In person, typically 20 to 30 people, and I'm seeing them 60 or 70 people participating in these Zoom meetings. We're able to utilize the technology through PowerPoint to show graphs, and everybody's able to see it at home while they're safe with their loved ones. So huge participation there. Also, the control. You have a little bit more control of your audience in a virtual setting, and so some of our boards don't have an issue with that, but some of them do. To be honest with you, some of them have issues with residents interrupting and so forth. So in the Zoom setting, they have a little bit more control with the mute button and other options. So absolutely agree with you, Bill, that we're going to continue seeing this in the future. And my boards are very pleased, for the most part, with the virtual setting of the board meetings. Now, I do have a handful that can't wait to start doing them in person, because there's advantages to that as well. Some of my communities use the in-person setting as a social event almost. So,
Right. And I think that that's important with a board meeting. So it's easier to manage the board meeting, right, Steve? While at the same time enjoying more participation actually from the membership. Is that a fair statement to say that we're actually seeing that in practice?
Absolutely. I mean, even the polling that you're doing in this webinar, I'm seeing that take place actually in board meetings to get a consensus to see what people are thinking. And it also has a little bit more engagement to it as well.
Right. Yeah, that's really great. It takes me back a little bit to when we first launched the community website, for example. And we had the new tool that was the first launch of online payments. Remember, everybody years ago had to send in a payment with a check and a payment coupon and all of this. The adoption was at first, do we need this and do we want to do this? And now all of a sudden, we see the metrics and the data. Everybody's absorbing information from their community website. Almost everybody's making ACH and their payments electronically. So now, again, just drawing parallels between then and today, we can really see that we've seen some of this before. So Kim, a lot of questions come up around the e-voting. Now, we're wrapping up annual meeting season. There's still a few out there that we need to do. So this is the perfect time to talk about this. What did we see in this year's annual voting season, annual meeting season? And not just board elections, but yeah, there's all important reserve votes as well, right, for the budget meetings. And then what are we thinking about as we prepare for next year's election season? Just give us some of your thoughts and best practices around e-voting.
So Bill, that's again a great question. And we did see a tremendous increase in online voting and the e-voting this year. As you said, for reserves, where associations were voting at budget time for reserves. And also they've used it for material alterations, voting around material alteration votes. For the most part, anything that your community would need to vote on, if they needed to vote on a loan, or some communities require votes for special assessments, they can be used for that too. As Steve mentioned polling, but we've seen a tremendous increase in e-voting online overall by communities. But we've also seen enhanced participation because we have a lot of owners that perhaps don't live in the US and live in foreign countries. So we know what the mail has been like just in the US, much less going to foreign countries. So the likelihood of some of these people even receiving their voting packages, get it in time to vote and return it, is not likely. So the e-voting has been really increased our participation overall in elections and other activities. And just for those communities that are not on e-voting, if you go on e-voting, it's not all or nothing. You have the opportunity for people to opt out of, you actually have to opt into e-voting. And so if you don't opt in, you'll still get a regular mailing package. If you opt in and then decide you want to go the old paper route, you can do that too. It's also made our meetings where we're counting votes, whether it's an election or other meeting, much more efficient because they get the vote count, the votes already come in. It's decreased the manual vote count process and the manual verification process. So it's made our meetings go a little faster, a little more efficient. And I think that the boards and communities have really learned to appreciate it. And just one of the things I'll share as a best practice for those communities that, whether it's an online meeting, a regular online meeting, or online voting, a meeting for an annual meeting on online voting, is to set up a virtual meeting in advance of that meeting and allow people to just log on, test their settings, test their audio. That way, if they need help with something, we really have the time, our administrative teams really have the time to help them get set up so they can properly attend the meeting, because it is frustrating for people if they log on and, you know, they can't see, they can't hear, right? And a lot of it's in their computer settings, but that's a great best practice to share among the communities, whether, again, it's online voting or just your regular virtual meetings.
Yeah, and Steve, I want to bring in on this as well. One of the things that Kim mentioned, and please give us your ideas, but I really like the online orientation process that I've seen so many communities do. I would encourage that as well as a takeaway today. If you're having a board meeting or you're going to have an online election, to a week before, send out the information to the entire membership and offer an online course. And you walk them through literally, here's where the chat is, this is the button, and you just walk all the residents through so they do have a comfort level. And I think the other thing, you know, that you mentioned, Kim, is it's not an all or nothing. A lot of boards I hear think, or membership really, think that way, where, oh my goodness, everything's going to be online. Well, we can still do a paper ballot and you can still get that. It's just adding another option, right? Steve, your thoughts on and your experience in this arena?
Yeah, the electronic voting is becoming extremely popular. You know, the only thing that I recommend is you also just have your attorney review your documents to make sure that it's allowed for your community. But it certainly helps streamline the process. I mean, annual meetings that would typically take hours counting ballots is literally cut in half because we have such a large participation in the e-voting. It's a great tool. I'm seeing a lot of movement in that direction, and you know, I just don't see any negative downside to it.
That's another good perspective. So Steve and Kim, you're seeing a lot of participation from residents in the e-voting. It's not just a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. All right, good. So I wanted to confirm that as well. There's another silver lining there as well. And Bobette, I know that it's not a huge measurable difference, but I think, you know, we have seen tweaks down in the budgets with the old office expense and the printing and postage line items, where a lot of the stuff, if you're registered, right, to ACH your payments or e-vote, for example, that just saves the association a couple of dollars here and there from having to print and mail and stuff envelopes, and the opportunity cost of the staff that's sitting in the office stuffing envelopes as opposed to walking the property, right?
Exactly. And don't forget the cookies and coffee, right? The
Oh,
refreshments. It adds up, right?
yes, yes, absolutely. Good stuff.
The USPS, the United States Postal Service, just put out an announcement too that their mailing is delayed due to staffing issues because of COVID. So I'm seeing that annual meeting packages, like Kim mentioned, it's being delayed getting into their hands. With the e-voting, if they're signed up and they're participating, it's electronic. It's not sent to them through the mail.
Yeah, and one of the challenges we saw in addition to that were anybody that still mailed an invoice. So any vendor that still mailed an invoice, we prefer the online system to make it so much more efficient. But to your point, Steve, we had to pick up the phone and call them and say, hey, listen, we just literally received this invoice in the mail today. It's already past due. And everyone seemed to understand. They seemed to know, yeah, we know that the Postal Service is having some challenges. We can't put our finger on, you know, all of it, but moving your payables right to the electronic online process as well is really going to help associations as we move forward.
Absolutely. You're getting your cash, you know, so if you're paying your assessment online, the cash is getting to your association faster and you can pay the bills. Equally, you can take care of your vendors because these days you want to make sure that you're maintaining a really good relationship with those vendors, and late payments will not help.
Right. So I think overall it's technology, from voting to payments to payables to just engaging with our membership. That is the trend, and that is for all of us to really embrace and enhance the efficiency of all of these aspects of the operation of each community. But I think it's also important to stay grounded for residents that do want to pick up the phone and call that manager, and they should be able to do that. And if they'd like to fill out a paper ballot and stick in the envelope, they should be able to do that as well. So I think we look at this from a perspective, we want to serve everyone appropriately, and add technology as another tool in your toolbox, as opposed to mandating it across the board for all business. We know that that doesn't work in every community.
Yeah.
Okay, so I do have another question here that just came in, Steve and Kim. So for you guys, it's another question around residents. I'm trying to translate this here. Residents or staff after gym or pool opened. So just recap if you could for us. You know, we're still doing some social distancing in the amenities. And we're still, in some cases, you know, the fitness center is the most popular amenity for the past several years now. And in most communities, we're still, you know, scheduling that so that we don't get too many people in the same place at the same time. Can you guys jump in and just reiterate some of the best practices there in the common areas and the amenities, and how do we keep everyone safe?
Yeah, so in my communities, the gym is being heavily used, and so what we're doing is obviously the equipment is in a spot like the the ellipticals and whatnot. What we did is we closed down every other one to space them out the 6 feet. We did that to help create social distancing there. Obviously, some, face mask and hand sanitizer, but we had the team on a routine schedule. That's one of the things that we had to adjust. Versus before, we were cleaning the gym once a day. Now we're cleaning it every 2 hours, going through and sanitizing the equipment. I have some of my properties even have a reservation policy. You have to make a reservation to go to the gym. So that way we can help monitor how many people are in the gym at one time. I see the communities that are smaller having more of a difficult time managing the situation because they don't necessarily have the staff. My larger communities that have the staff, they're able to monitor how many people are in there and also make sure that people are wearing proper PPE, face masks, and sanitizing the equipment.
Right. Kim, anything to add to that in the amenities?
Yeah, I know that Steve covered the gyms, but swimming pools and obviously the beaches are pretty big down here. So we've had also pool attendants and beach attendants sanitizing chairs on duty, sanitizing chairs and making sure. One of the things that we did early on at a lot of our properties in the pandemic, based on the recommendations from the CDC, was suspend towel service, right? So that was a change that we had to manage through. Was a savings to the association, another way to conserve their cash by not doing that. But it was a change for the association and a change for the residents, bringing their own towels and things. But, you know, our teams are sanitizing chairs, making sure that they're properly socially distanced. We marked out on a lot of the properties where the pool chairs needed to be. In some cases, they were affixed so they couldn't be moved, or could only be moved by a pool attendant if they needed to be moved and grouped into a family gathering. So those are some of the other things, you know, with regard to amenities. And as I mentioned, some amenities are still closed. Saunas and things like that are still closed. So we really look forward to really providing great service to the residents while keeping them safe at the same time.
Right, really trying to keep those amenities. I think the key answer to the question is also to keep the amenities as activated as possible. Really do your best to bring the lifestyle back to your community to the extent that you can and feel safe doing it. A couple of other notes that we're evaluating, so a sneak peek into the future here. And I'm seeing this with developers and new development business. And I'm also seeing this now, we're evaluating it for existing communities. And those are the lights that go into the elevators, for example, that literally sanitize the elevator when nobody's on it. And so there's some retrofit, there's some technology coming on. Another note here is you mentioned the pools, the outside pool furniture, and looking at the special coatings that are being used now that are antimicrobial, that could be safer for all residents and their guests on the pool furniture. So we need to continue that cleaning and sanitizing, continue that vigilance. But again, back to new technologies, right? What are these other things that we're going to implement? We want to stay on the cutting edge of those items and bring those to board members and managers so that they know what the options could be. And by the way, that's going to go all the way back to those preventative maintenance and those capital improvement projects that we were talking about. So this will all be integrated into that process. So look forward to that coming and more information on that as we work through it. One of the things we want to do is just qualify the validity, the best suppliers, right? The most reliable warranties and some of the business terms for everybody.
So Bill, Chris Normandeau in our value engineering and procurement department has done a great job with a lot of our associations. In the beginning, we all saw a lot of things come out making claims. And Chris was able to review a lot of those for us and determine, whether or not they were appropriate for use. And sometimes they didn't really meet the things that they were claiming. So that was a great advantage for a lot of our communities.
Yeah, we have to be vigilant. And the other thing, we have the benefit of seeing and working with developers in new construction. So we're seeing that developers are actually doing this now. They're building some of these things into their building under construction while they can now. That's great for that building. And that's great to support the membership in that building. But it also applies to every other community up and down the street, right? We want to make sure that we're maintaining and enhancing values at every community that we manage. So sharing all those best practices is critically important. Okay, so just another quick check here on the Q&A. It looks like we touched most of them. Kim, I know that you have some insight here. I didn't see this question coming, but you sit on some of these task forces. So it might be interesting for folks to know, with international travel ban in place now as of January 26th, I guess that's appropriate, 2021, is the Condo Association required to ask international travelers to self-quarantine or produce a negative test result? Have you seen that?
So that's an interesting question, Bill. We have seen that come up. The first thing I'll always recommend is that you contact association counsel and confer with association counsel. But I'll also share with you that as per the CDC guidelines, when international travelers are returning, they are advised as they return to the country through the airports or train terminals or that as to what they need to do and the testing and quarantine responsibilities.
Right. So there is a protocol in place.
There is a protocol in place.
And we should all know that and expect that they've received that information upon entering the country. But again, it's hard, and we've faced this, right? It's hard to tell people, we know you've been abroad and you have to lock yourself in your unit. And so we need to deal with that with diligence. And I think if absolutely necessary, we'll engage association counsel.
I think we've done that earlier in 2020. We saw it just from state to state in the US when people coming from certain states or Florida to other places were required to quarantine. And it was a very similar situation. They were advised by the airlines or the transportation industry as they arrived what they needed to do.
Right, exactly. Okay. All right, good. Okay, so I think we've caught up. There are a couple other questions here that definitely are going to be very community specific, and we want to respect everyone's time today. So I'll make sure that you get those answers. We'll get those downloaded and we'll get those to the right person for those of you with those questions. We'll make sure you get those answers. So with that, Steve, Bobette, Kim, thank you all so much for your time and support today. I think it was a great session, really wrapping up some of the loose ends from 2020 and applying those learnings to 2021. I feel like we're all very optimistic. This is going to be a year of improvement and positive change as we move forward. And to all of our guests today, thank you so much for attending today's session. Again, you will receive a recording of the session to refer back to. We hope that you were able to take one or two best practices back to your communities today. That's the purpose of these sessions. And please feel free to reach out if you think of another question. Get it over to us. We'll make sure to take care of it. The email address will be there as part of the communication. So thank you all once again, and have a safe rest of the week. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.